By late November 1923, $1 was worth 4.2 trillion German marks, a figure recorded on November 20th of that year. Not million, not billion, trillion. A decade earlier, that same dollar had been worth just 4.2 marks. The mark had collapsed from 4.2 per dollar to 4.2 trillion, virtually erasing all meaningful value in less than 10 years. Not because of a foreign invasion, not because of a natural disaster, but because a government chose to print money to pay its debts. And the group that suffered most visibly was not the poor. It was the saving middle class, the ones who had done everything right, saved for decades, put money in the bank, trusted the system. Within months, their entire lives of accumulated work had become mathematically worthless. This is the story of how one of the most educated, industrialized nations in the world destroyed itself from the inside, and what it set in motion for the rest of the 20th century. Welcome to Financial Origins, where we trace the real roots of wealth, collapse, and the systems that shape everyday life. Every great economic catastrophe started with a decision. Let's follow it. To understand what was destroyed, you first need to understand what existed. Before the First World War, Germany was one of the most impressive industrial economies on the planet. Its cities were modern, its universities were world-class, and its middle class was growing steadily. A school teacher, a factory foreman, a civil servant. These were people who could afford a modest home, set aside money each month, and retire with something real to show for a lifetime of work. The German mark was a credible currency. In 1914, it took approximately 4.2 marks to buy $1. Prices were stable, savings were real. A mark deposited in a bank today would still be a mark tomorrow. This stability was not accidental. The German monetary system before the war was anchored to gold. The Reichsbank, Germany's central bank, could not simply print money at will. The amount of currency in circulation was tied to actual reserves. That constraint mattered. It kept the system honest. And then the war came. To finance the First World War, Germany abandoned the gold standard and began borrowing heavily. The government issued war bonds, expecting to win quickly and pay everything back with reparations extracted from a defeated enemy. That calculation proved catastrophically wrong. Germany lost, and at a scale it had not prepared for. Consider a man we will call Friedrich. Not a specific historical individual, but a composite representing hundreds of thousands of Germans in exactly his position. He is a civil servant in his 50s, living in Frankfurt. He spent 30 years in government service. He owns no land, no stocks, no gold. His entire financial life exists in a savings account and a small pension fund. He did what every responsible citizen was told to do. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, established Germany's war guilt and created the framework for reparations. The precise total, 132 billion gold marks, was fixed 2 years later, in May 1921, by the Allied Reparation Commission under what became known as the London Schedule of Payments. It was a sum exceeding 3 times Germany's pre-war annual economic output. The German government was simultaneously managing a shattered economy, a demobilized military, and a population demanding stability. Its revenues were nowhere near what it needed to meet its obligations. The Reichsbank faced a choice that was, given the political pressures of the moment, almost inevitable. It began printing money. At first, the inflation was noticeable but felt manageable. By 1920, the exchange rate had fallen to roughly 60 marks per dollar. Politicians argued the situation was temporary. Economists warned it was not. Then came 1923. The reparations schedule required Germany to make payments in gold or foreign currency. The country did not have enough. In January of that year, France and Belgium, after Germany defaulted on reparation deliveries, including timber and coal, occupied the Ruhr, the heart of German industrial production. The German government responded by encouraging workers to strike and paying their wages anyway. To do that, the Reichsbank had to print even faster. What followed was not gradual. It was a near vertical collapse. At the start of 1923, $1 bought roughly 17,000 marks. By mid-year, that figure had reached the hundreds of thousands. By autumn, it had crossed into the hundreds of millions. By late November, it stood at 4.2 trillion. For Friedrich, the destruction was silent and swift. His savings account had held the equivalent of several years of living expenses. By late November, that same account could not purchase a single loaf of bread. The number in the account was technically larger. Inflation adjustments had been applied. But it had grown at a fraction of the speed that prices had grown. His savings had been quietly consumed by the printing press. At street level, the experience was physically disorienting. Employers began paying workers twice a day, once in the morning and once at midday, because wages paid at dawn were worth measurably less by noon. Workers went to shops immediately after receiving payment, buying whatever they could before prices were updated again. Holding cash overnight meant losing value you could measure. Prices on restaurant menus changed between the time a customer ordered and the time the bill arrived. Some establishments charged in advance. Barter became common. A farmer would exchange eggs for shoes. A doctor would accept coal as payment for a consultation. One of the more documented phenomena of that period was the use of banknotes as fuel. By late 1923, bundles of low-denomination marks were cheaper than firewood. Families burned currency in their stoves. Children are shown in photographs from that period playing with stacks of bills the way children play with building blocks, not because their parents were wealthy, but because the paper had lost nearly all practical value. The Reichsbank was printing money so fast it could not keep pace with its own inflation. New denominations appeared almost weekly, first thousands, then millions, then billions. Then by late November, trillions entered everyday vocabulary. The mechanism behind all of this is straightforward. When a government increases the money supply faster than the economy produces goods and services, each unit of currency buys less. What happened in Germany between 1921 and 1923 was that process running entirely unchecked. Every mark printed to pay a wage or a debt diluted every mark already in circulation. The more desperate the printing, the faster the dilution. The faster the dilution, the more printing was needed. It was a self-reinforcing cycle with no natural stopping point. The cycle was only broken in November 1923, when Germany introduced a new currency, the Rentenmark, backed not by gold, which Germany no longer had, but by a notional mortgage on Germany's agricultural and industrial land. One Rentenmark was exchanged for 1 trillion old marks. Prices stabilized almost immediately, but the damage to savings was permanent and total. What happened in Germany was extreme, but it was not unique. The same pattern, a government facing unsustainable obligations, printing money to close the gap, triggering a currency collapse, has appeared repeatedly across different countries and periods. Hungary in 1946 produced the most severe currency collapse on record. At its peak, prices were doubling every 15 hours. The Hungarian government introduced a denomination called the sextillion pengo, a number with 21 zeros. Like Germany, Hungary had emerged from a devastating war with its economy in ruins and its government obligations far exceeding any available revenue. Zimbabwe between 2007 and 2009 offers a more recent and thoroughly documented example. Years of policies that severely damaged agricultural production collapsed government revenues. To fund public spending, the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe printed money at extraordinary rates. By November 2008, Zimbabwe's monthly inflation rate was estimated at 79.6 billion%. The central bank eventually issued a $100 trillion banknote, which at the time of printing was worth roughly $30 on the informal market. Zimbabwe ultimately abandoned its own currency entirely in 2009, adopting foreign currencies for all domestic transactions. The common thread across these cases is specific and identifiable. A government has obligations it cannot meet through taxation or sustainable borrowing. It instructs its central bank to create money. New money enters circulation, competes for the same goods, and prices rise. As people realize that money is losing value, they spend faster, which accelerates price increases. Those who hold physical assets, land, gold, foreign currency, real goods, are partially protected. Those who hold savings, pensions, and bonds bear the full cost. What varies between cases is the speed. What does not vary is the mechanism. Understanding this pattern matters because versions of it continue to surface in the modern world. Venezuela experienced severe monetary instability between 2016 and 2019 after years of spending funded partly through money creation. When oil revenues collapsed, the bolivar entered a spiral that reduced its real value by millions of percent across those years. The middle class, which had built savings and stability over decades, saw those holdings effectively erased. In developed economies today, central banks operate with mandates specifically designed to prevent this outcome. Independence from government, inflation targets, reserve requirements, these are institutional responses to exactly the kind of failure that consumed the German mark. They are not perfect systems, but they exist because the historical record of what happens in their absence is unambiguous. If this kind of analysis, the real decisions behind the economic systems that shape daily life, is something worth exploring further, subscribing and leaving a like genuinely helps this channel continue producing work like this. Return now to Friedrich. By the end of 1923, his savings, the result of 30 years of disciplined work, were gone. Not reduced, not depleted, mathematically indistinguishable from zero. The contract he had entered into, work, save, trust the system, had been voided from the other side, not by a foreign power, but by a cascade of decisions made by his own government under pressures it had, in part, created. He was not alone. Historians note that the German middle class, teachers, civil servants, small business owners, pensioners, was among the most severely affected by the collapse. A lifetime of accumulated savings, bonds, and pension entitlements had lost all real value. That loss was not recoverable. What followed was not only economic hardship, it was something more consequential, a large population with accumulated grievances and a reasonable belief that the institutions they had trusted had failed them completely. The German middle class, which in a stable society tends to anchor political moderation, had been economically hollowed out. The Weimar Republic, the democratic government that had overseen the collapse, bore the weight of that failure in public memory for years afterward. Adolf Hitler's attempted coup, the Beer Hall Putsch, took place on November 8th and 9th of 1923, during the acute phase of the crisis. It failed, and Hitler was imprisoned. But the conditions that had made such movements possible did not disappear with the stabilization of the currency. By the early 1930s, when Germany was struck by the Great Depression and unemployment climbed above 30%, the dynamics shifted decisively. That second shock, independent in its origins, global in its reach, fell on a population already carrying a decade of accumulated distrust toward democratic institutions. The hyperinflation had eroded confidence in the Weimar system. The Depression then removed the economic ground beneath it entirely. Hitler came to power through elections in 1933, carried by a coalition that included a middle class that had never fully recovered its faith in the institutions that had failed it a decade earlier. The hyperinflation of 1923 did not cause what followed. History is never that linear, but it destabilized trust in the Weimar system at a foundational level, and that destabilization became one of the conditions, alongside the Depression and deliberate political choices, that made the 1930s possible. What the story of 1923 ultimately reveals is something about the nature of money itself. A currency functions because people believe it will function. It is not inherently valuable. It is valuable because there is a shared agreement, enforced by institutions, laws, and consistent behavior, that it will hold its worth. The moment that agreement begins to break down, the process of its collapse can accelerate far faster than almost anyone expects. Because trust does not erode at a steady pace. Once it starts, it tends to fall. The German middle class of 1923 did not lose their savings because they made poor decisions. They lost them because they trusted the institutions that governed them, and those institutions failed under pressures they had, in part, created themselves. The war debt, the reparations, the printing press. Each step seemed necessary, or at least unavoidable to the people making those decisions at the time. The accumulated effect was irreversible. This is what economists call systemic risk, a risk that does not arise from individual failures, but from the structure of the system itself. The institutions that exist today to manage these risks are not abstract bureaucratic constructs. They are the direct response to what happened in Germany in 1923, in Hungary in 1946, and in Zimbabwe in 2008. They exist because the historical record of their absence is written in the lives of people like Friedrich. Friedrich's savings did not vanish because of a war, a theft, or a flood. They vanished because of a decision, made in a government building by people managing a crisis they had helped to create, to print their way out of a problem that printing could only make worse. That decision, and the millions who bore its consequences, left a mark on the 20th century that outlasted the currency itself. The next time you hear that a government is struggling to finance its obligations, it is worth asking how it intends to close the gap, and who will ultimately pay the cost.